We are using energy to a large degree to enable a phase transformation of the Earth's crust into the stuff of civilization, including you and I. You can make people, you can make buildings, you can make roads. The heating for the greenhouse effect is ultimately due to this material transformation of stuff that was in the Earth's crust, where we used energy to access this raw material, pollute as we're creating networks, and then create carbon dioxide, which is also a form of pollution. And we got pollution everywhere. It's not just global warming. It is the fact that we are transforming the makeup of the environment around us, and it's becoming less hospitable for us.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Tim Garrett. Tim is a professor of atmospheric sciences at the University of Utah, and this is actually the second time that I've had him on the show. Over 2 years ago, Tim joined me to discuss the thermodynamics of collapse, where he explained his research into the behaviour of snowflakes and how you could extrapolate the behaviour of economies and civilization using the laws of thermodynamics. I loved that first conversation, and Tim and I have stayed in touch over the years, and I asked him to come back on because I was curious. According to thermodynamics, can we achieve degrowth? This question might surprise people. Why wouldn't we be able to achieve degrowth? Well, because everything is always tending towards growth or decay, and that's how ecosystems sort of balance themselves holistically. And essentially, I wanted Tim to give us an overview of the relationship between our energy consumption, our material footprint, and our economies, what we come to refer to as the Holy Trinity throughout the episode, and what we can understand about that Holy Trinity to map the possibilities for human civilization in the coming decades. I love these kinds of conversations. This is some big picture stuff. Pretty bound up in science, but Tim really helpfully uses lots of allegories throughout, so don't worry if you, like me, are not a physicist. And as I say in the episode, this conversation confirmed a suspicion I've had of late, which is that whilst we're talking more and more about the connection between energy and economy, which is really critical, the material part has kind of been forgotten about, the matter of the universe. And this is important because human civilization is essentially one big transformation process of matter from one thing to another, from natural resources to huge societies. Tim walks us through that by explaining the Holy Trinity, and then talks about this thermodynamic impetus to grow. How is it that we use our energy, the necessity of a surplus of energy, and how all of this relates to an organism or a society's growth and health? I found all of this conversation fascinating, but there are a couple of really interesting moments that I want to flag here before we kick off. The first was the question about whether or not renewable energy will facilitate our consumption of fossil fuels. And that's because the more energy that is available, the more an economy grows, and the more energy that it needs to sustain that growth. There's another interesting moment when we talk about inequality and energy, where Tim reveals that high energy clouds also have the highest rates of inequality. And so we use this to reverse engineer the degrowth question, exploring how we can reduce inequality by reducing energy demands. And finally, we talk about the maximum power law. These inequalities are present throughout the universe, that some have more while many have less. And this takes us up to thinking about the solutions. How to imagine a society that allows itself to decay and grow, rather than committed to a super exponential growth path. We can think of this problem as a wave, as Tim puts it. The thing is, we need the political willpower and the imagination in order to figure out how to do it, how to decline in order to recover, before we crash with no possibility of recovery. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community, who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Tim, welcome back to Planet Critical. It's such a pleasure to have you on the show once again.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So it's been a couple of years since we spoke, and whilst I don't think I have a better grasp of physics, I think I have a better grasp now.
I'm not sure I do either.
Somehow I thought you might say that. I think I have a better grasp of how these systems all interplay with one another. And so I'm really looking forward to sort of picking your brain with a couple of years more education under my belt. But to kick us off, you get the same question as everyone else, which is, why is the world in crisis?
Why is the world in crisis? Well, that's a great question. I mean, yes, it's in crisis for two main reasons, I think, are the ones that a lot of us think about. One is obviously that we're looking at environmental degradation. We've seen a massive reduction in the species and populations of those species around us. We are seeing carbon dioxide levels that have risen now to levels that, we might start thinking about planetary average temperatures, perhaps, a few degrees, 5 degrees Celsius higher than they are than they were at pre-industrial levels, with associated sea level rise, ocean calcification, disappearance of coral reefs, loss of species all over the planet, perhaps necessary human migrations out of places like India. And at the same time, we are arguably running out of the resources that are required to sustain us, the ones that have made us so successful in the first place, which really are things like fossil fuels. I mean, here we are speaking English. Why are we speaking English? I mean, it all rests on the backs of things like coal, which the British Empire really got to exploiting to the greatest degree first in the world. And here we are, where we need energy to survive. At the same time, our exploitation of the energy is leading to a degradation of the environment that we lean upon to keep us alive. And so if that's not a crisis, I don't know what is, because this is happening at a global scale. And it is also happening at an accelerating rate. And that's something I'm not sure that we fully appreciate. We have this sense of history that goes back thousands of years. But we are looking at doubling our needs from the environment in the next 30 years compared to everything we've accumulated in our needs over the past, 10,000. Things are moving fast. Really probably faster than we can adapt and keep up. But I would also say that ultimately, fundamentally, the universe is deterministic. So are we in crisis now, or have we always been in crisis? This was something where the wheels were perhaps set in motion a couple million years ago when we became the first and only species, which is, I think, totally remarkable, to get control of fire. I mean, it wasn't us, our species specifically, but it's a predecessor to us. And at the point at which we were able to accelerate oxidation reactions to our own needs, bending them to our own needs, we just took over. And that was a remarkable event, and it's taken a while to lead us to where we are now, but that's the world we are built on, is in some ways accelerated oxidation. It enables us to do rather a lot, and of course fire is the foundation of that.
You're talking about really quite devastating things, but you speak about them really beautifully. I could imagine this being a kind of collapse audiobook for before one goes to sleep. I think let's break this down into a couple of things. I want to immediately jump into the deterministic thing, but before we do that, we will. Just for anyone new that might need to be caught up, essentially, what is the relationship between sort of like civilizations and energy? And why is it that our energy exploitation is degrading our environment? And why can't we just substitute all of that with renewable energy?
So you've had a prior guest, Steve Keen, who I've co-authored a couple of papers with, and he has you're talking about phrasing things eloquently. He has a nice, eloquent line about labor and capital. So economists like to think about labor and capital, and Steve Keen's an economist. That's the training it comes from. And his line is that labor without energy is a corpse, and capital without energy is a statue. And the idea here is that, economists will have something called a production function. They're very interested in things like the GDP. And the GDP in their models is a function of labor and capital in some utterly inane way that any physicist who looked at it would just vomit because the units don't match. How did this make it past the gate? But anyway, that's what they do, and they seem to make happy livings out of it. And Steve had the insight that, you actually need energy. Because, if we didn't have energy, if we didn't have food to keep us alive, of course, we need the energy to keep us going. And it works out, depends on how big we are. But someone like myself, it might be 2,500 calories a day, say, just to keep me going, right? And, well, we need energy just to sustain ourselves. We also need energy to sustain everything that is around us, our cars and our factories, and everything else needs energy too, just to keep moving. And here is something where I think I've added something that's goes a bit beyond what Steve Keen was talking about, which is not just that we have these individual things like capital and labor that consume energy in order to do whatever they need to do, or the work, or to economic production, or whatever it is. But rather, everything in civilization, all of us, is a massive accumulation of networks. I think that's the best way to think about this, that there are networks in society at all levels. And it is through these networks that, to use a physics terminology, that energy is dissipated. So we have energy that is useful, and we might call that available energy or accessible energy, or if you really want to get fancy, Gibbs-free energy. But it's energy that is available to do thermodynamic work. By doing work, it is dissipated. But it is dissipated by following a line. And it is that aspect of thinking about lines that I think is one that is largely missed, but is totally central to thinking appropriately about the role of energy in keeping us going as a civilization, and also the role of energy in leading to waste byproducts. So if you think about a brain, that's a massive arrangement of very dense networks, and our brains interact and sort of become very similar in many ways. So our brains are quite alike, and our thoughts are quite similar, and our educations, all speaking English here. We also have networks like roads. We have telecommunications networks. You can think about the cardiovascular system within our bodies. All of this is networks. And if you think about how do these networks work, well, if they had no energy, nothing would be happening. I mean, there's just nothing going on. But it is by having essentially some sort of explosion that pushes something along these networks in order for something to be done. And then there's a return circulation, and there's explosion, return circulation. It's all an engine. And then, so for some reason I got tied to this line, civilization as a heat engine. I imagine I wrote it at some point, but I'm not quite sure where. But it's an okay line, I'll take it. So civilization is a heat engine. The idea that a heat engine is a thermodynamic idea that you have explosion, push, explosion, push, explosion, push. And then if we start thinking about civilization being explosion, push, whether it's neuronal transformations, pushing of electrical signals along our brains, or blood pumping around our bodies, or cars pushing along roads, or communication signals along wires, whatever it is. Explosion, push, and things happen. But then there are byproducts to this, of course. So we have the energy, we consume it, and that leaves behind waste. Now, the waste from the energy is actually fairly innocuous. For the most part, it's pretty innocuous. It's waste heat is the word that would be used thermodynamically. It's energy, but it's energy that's no longer useful. Heat it's a bit of a vague term, but you think, if we have a car, it gets really hot inside, but then the exhaust goes out the back, and then that heats up the air, and that air has little convection currents that are created, and those little convection currents will rise upwards in the atmosphere, and they go high enough in the atmosphere, and then it radiates to space, and bye-bye. It's gone, and we don't have to worry about the waste heat so much.
Wow.
Well, it could get too hot, yeah. It could get too hot, yeah. I mean, you can have a heat island effect in a city, right? I mean, you can have all sorts of things.
Also global warming, right? Global boiling.
No. That is not that heat. That's not that energy. That energy is gone.
Okay.
So that's the basic mechanism of the planet. The first and foremost, the thing any planet does, is radiate energy to space. Mm-hmm. And on Earth, we have, thankfully, unlike Venus, we have what we call the atmospheric window between 8 micrometers and 12 micrometers wavelength. There is a space where water vapor does not absorb that radiation that is rising upwards radiating upwards, and it actually goes to space reasonably effectively. So we actually are able to lose energy from our planet quite efficiently. And that brings us to the thing that so many people leave out from this equation, which is there is energy, there's also matter. And it is the material aspect that is very often ignored. So there's plenty of people who've had the bright idea that maybe energy is related to economic production, say. And I actually have an approach that's different from that, even with regards to energy. But there's the idea that, they put 2 and 2 together. We need energy to make things happen. Okay, that's fine. But we also need raw materials. Mm-hmm. Raw materials are very much a part of this. And you think about you and I, we're not, there's energy pushing things around, but you and I are made of matter. Everything around us is made of matter. That matter had to come from somewhere. It required energy to do, in some ways, a phase transformation. So if you put, an ice cube in your drink, it melts. That's a phase transformation. Well, we're using energy. Well, and when that ice cube melts, of course, it's taking energy out of the water in order to cool it down. We are using energy to a large degree to enable a phase transformation of the Earth's crust, that stuff that's accessible to us, into the stuff of civilization. including you and I. You can make people, you can make buildings, you can make roads, you can make telecommunications networks, all those things that have those energetic circulations. These circulations have to happen down networks, and the networks are made of matter. So where does that matter come from? Well, that's obviously part of the equation, is that we are doing these material transformations of converting the Earth's crust into the very thing that we can use to do economic work, which is these networks that enable us to dissipate energy. And that is where we run into problems, of course, environmentally, because, well, two things. One is, that phase transformation may be habitat, right? I mean, it could be trees. It could be transformations of forests into farmland. It could be gold mines that pollute otherwise pristine rainforest. And also, even things like fossil fuels are made of matter, and there's carbon in there. And that carbon is transformed from a state that would normally take a very, very long time to get oxidized and turn into carbon dioxide. And we're making it happening. Well, it's effectively instantaneous that we're doing this transformation of turning countless millions of years of buried carbon and putting it into the atmosphere. And so that is where the heating comes from, is because the carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. The carbon dioxide is effectively closing that window I mentioned that lets the Earth's energy radiate to space. And by closing that window, the Earth gets warmer. And then it's not just carbon dioxide, more water vapor evaporates from the oceans, and the water vapor concentration gets higher. And that's actually most of what our greenhouse effect is water vapor. So the heating for the greenhouse effect is ultimately due to this material transformation of stuff that was in the Earth's crust, where we used energy to access this raw material, create networks, pollute as we're creating networks, and then create carbon dioxide, which is also a form of pollution. And we got pollution everywhere that has a wide range of problems. It's not just global warming. It is the fact that we are transforming the makeup of the environment around us, and it's becoming less hospitable for us.
Okay. That was excellent. I don't think you answered my questions exactly, but that was excellent. So let's just keep pushing at that. Why can't we, according to all of this, like these networks and materials and energy and this like disconnect that we have of understanding the sort of the fundamental links between material, matter and energy, let alone energy and economy. Why does this mean that we cannot simply substitute out our fossil fuels for a renewable economy? I mean, listen, I can give you reasons as to the fact that mining is the largest driver of environmental conflict in the world. And, we just can't support that without destroying all biodiversity and pollution and, all of this kind of stuff. But thermodynamically, why is that a disaster?
Yeah, I mean, I live in an area where, southern Utah, Nevada, they're basically paving over desert tortoise habitat with solar panels. And yeah, there is now an area of the planet that was largely untouched that is now a wonderful resource for energy, which is solar energy. And there are lithium mines conveniently out there too. So yes, I mean, this is just another transformation of the Earth's crust. But to get to your question, thermodynamically, why can't we do a transformation to solar energy from fossil energy? Okay, well, I'll just start observationally, what we see happening is that throughout history, we tend to have like an energy source. So of course, we start by burning, let's say, wood, historically. And then we added coal. First off, pretty bad coal, like brown coal. And then we moved to anthracite, which is a very much higher density coal. And that really set off the United States and its westward expansion because they found a lot of that in Pennsylvania. And then we have oil, and then we have natural gas. And, you think about oil and natural gas versus coal. I mean, you could say, yeah, these are actually, because they're liquid or gaseous form, they're actually much more useful because you can transport them much more easily than you can coal. And indeed, we've found a great number of ways to use oil and natural gas. And you might say, well, then we would have expected us to abandon coal. And that's not actually what happened because, of course, coal is still useful. I mean, I'm probably doing this talk with you right now largely based off a coal-fired power plant. And, coal is great as a source of electrical energy. So we use coal now. We are able to use quite a lot of coal because oil and natural gas enabled us to have a boom as a civilization, particularly between 1950 and 1970, that enabled us to take off so that we were able to do more of these material transformations of the Earth's crust into us. By virtue of having the oil and natural gas, we were able to grow faster. And because we were able to grow faster, I think what happened is that we didn't stop burning coal. In fact, we actually eventually started burning more coal than we did prior to 1950s because there's more of us. We added the natural gas and the oil, then population exploded, the world got tremendously more wealthy, and then the demand for everything increased, including just baseload electrical power. And of course, coal does that. And so this is my concern about wind and solar power, is that I have not seen anywhere an argument beyond an assumption that these sources of fuel will replace fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are useful. We can do stuff with fossil fuels. They are quite easy to use. I have an off-grid cabin. I have a solar system for that cabin. At the end of the day, honestly, it's a total pain in the ass. It is so complicated compared to just my backup generator. Backup generator, like 5 things can go wrong, and then I can fix those. Solar system, it's actually a very sophisticated system. If with competent engineers, presumably we can make that work. But fossil fuels are useful. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see what will happen. I suspect that what will happen is that solar power will enable us to do more of this transformation of the Earth's crust into the stuff of us. It will facilitate our growth. And there may be fluctuations where we see little times where it looks like solar's replacing. But if it's actually enabling us to grow, we will ultimately demand more of energy of all kinds. So it may be that solar energy is not just replacing, but it is even facilitating our consumption of fossil fuels by enabling civilization to grow faster than it would have otherwise. Now, I could go into, there are analogs here in thermodynamics looking at a molecular level, that if you look at an ideal gas, and people poo-poo looking at ideal gases, but I think this is actually a really good way to do it. If you have a really, an ideal gas can have various modes for the molecular motion. It can have rotational modes, translational modes, and vibrational modes, and eventually electronic transitions. Now, basically, a molecule can spin, it can move around, or it can vibrate. Our atmosphere at our temperatures only has rotational translational modes. So the oxygen and nitrogen molecules, they spin around or they can move around. And that's sort of the temperature we feel is the moving around part. If the temperature got up to 2200 Kelvin, or thereabouts, then suddenly the molecules would start vibrating. Okay, so we add enough energy, a new source of energy would come up, and new ways of being, new modes of activating these molecules could happen. I mean, think about civilization. We're doing things in a different way. We're doing solar and wind. But it's not like the rotational modes and translational modes go away. Actually, they're all interacting with the vibrational modes. So the assumption that adding a new way of being takes away from the old way, I think is a very strong assumption. And I worry that we are getting it wrong, that we are paving over desert tortoise habitat, pretending we're saving the planet, when in fact we're just doing what we've always done, which is destroy it.
This to me is very interesting because a lot of my conversations are increasingly now going in this direction. I think at the beginning, a lot of it was dominated by, certainly on this show and kind of more generally, about energy, fuels, what kind of fuels to use, the benefits of fossil fuels with regards to energy density versus, you know, their impact on the atmosphere, and which then has a downstream of impact on the planet as a whole. Versus, you know, the benefits of renewables, which could be decentralized, which politically is very, very interesting. But the fact that it's, you just can't quite substitute them in, you know, it's a little bit more complicated. You know, batteries, intermittency, yada, yada, all this kind of stuff. Increasingly, the conversation is becoming, as you were saying, about matter. And this connection between energy and matter and economy. And it seems to be kind of almost this like a holy trinity, and it's surprising that it's sort of taking so long, well, for some of us, I'm sure not for everyone, to really get this clear grasp. And I think obviously, and I'm biased given what I do, but I think that the language that we use around these terms, these problems, really, really obfuscates the reality, right? The fact that we talk about energy as if, you know, it is totally divorced from needing a material conduit, essentially, to go down these networks, as you were describing. But it seems to me, I mean, I remember once an engineer telling me, you know, there's sort of like infinite almost amounts of energy in the universe. Like we will always have access to energy. And for that reason, he wasn't really particularly worried about human civilization. And yet, listening to you and listening to others, that seems to be the case. Yeah, sure. Technically, there's about as much energy as you could want. But the idea is that our material resources are limited. This planet is finite. Matter is finite. And that is being revealed by, you know, mad plans, or ideas at least, to go and mine the moon in order to create these conduits for our energy supply. And obviously, as you were saying, this all relates to growth, the need to sustain oneself, or for civilization to sustain itself. And that seemingly to be predicated on this constant growth pattern. And you've written about sort of steady state economies and all this kind of thing. And I think we should now try and veer into that and try and, you know, make this all connect up to GDP, wealth, the power value of wealth, all of these kinds of things. Because why could it not be, hypothetically, is it possible that we could create and design our economies in a way where our material footprint was limited because our energy demands were limited, and our economy was in a kind of like, not a steady state, but kind of cycling through dips and peaks that were healthy, that kept everything holistically in balance? Is that possible, or do things need to grow in order to survive, and when they stop growing, they decay?
Yeah, so that gets fun and hard as a problem. But I mean, I think the first step is to try to understand where growth comes from. And yes, I've done some work on this, trying to lay down the physics and mathematics. And, as we discussed last time, sort of my guiding principle was actually thinking about how snowflakes grow. I'm actually, we didn't actually discuss this yet, this talk, but I'm an atmospheric scientist. That's how I make my living. It's nothing to do with economics or society. My funding is either to look at how snowflakes grow or how clouds grow, and also how they collapse and decay. And I got interested in the societal growth problem because I sort of, in the famous arrogance of physicists, I figured, well, everything's a physics problem. And I should be able to apply these basic principles from looking at snowflakes and clouds to human society. And then I tried to do that and came up with a model for how this works. And then, of course, as many academics do, they think they found something totally original and they're very proud of themselves, and they found that somebody figured it out a century prior. And indeed, somebody had more or less figured it out a century prior. And it was someone called Alfred Lotka, who had talked about civilization being, in some sense, a wheel. And I sort of started a paper with the title Lotka's Wheel, because I thought this was a really cool idea. And his idea was that, everything is trying to process energy and matter. And, you can think about there being a wheel. And, curiously, that was exactly the image I had developed in my mind, was a wheel, and that the wheel takes energy and matter that enables the wheel to be manufactured in the first place, but also then have some sort of interface with its environment so that it can consume the energy and then start spinning, and then it gives off waste energy. And Lotka made the point that humanity is no different than anything else in the universe or on Earth or any of the critters on Earth. We've just managed to grow that wheel faster and make it spin faster. We're just really, really good at this. And of course, that was coming back to that oxidation speed thing. Fire was really the thing that enabled us to do it. And you think this was a paper from 1922. Of course, it wasn't solar power. It was very much fossil fuel combustion back then. And Lotka also made the point, which I was probably much slower to come to realizing, which is that you can only grow the wheel so that it can spin faster and consume more if there is a surplus. Mm-hmm. And so you have to have a surplus of energy and matter in order for the system to be able to grow. So just to keep itself going, any system, any critter, biological, or even you could think about a hurricane or a cloud or a snowflake. It has to, in order to sustain itself, it has to consume energy. But because it's consuming energy, it is losing energy too. So it has to constantly refine the energy, and it may just maintain a steady state. So, I guess it's a struggle of all of us in adulthood is actually to maintain a steady state and not put on weight. And inevitably we seem to put on weight, but we want to try to maintain a steady state even as we are constantly consuming, let's say, that 2,500 calories a day. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're like the average American, there is a vast surplus of food, and with that vast surplus, it's actually more than possible to put on weight because, there's more available than you actually need, and with more available, you can consume more and you can actually grow a little bit. So if we look at civilization right now, it turns out our daily energy needs are about the equivalent of 300 million barrels of oil. And, getting ready for this interview, I was trying to think of a way to make the energy in 300 million barrels of oil seem more tangible. beyond just saying that's a lot, and I totally failed. It's a lot of energy, right? 300 million barrels of oil every day. That is what we need just to keep us going.
Well, Tim, could we not do Nate's thing here? Like 1 barrel of oil is equivalent to 5 years worth of one man's work.
Oh, yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we could do that. Okay,
I
so then
can't
we
do
got
that math.
1,500 million years of work every day.
In one day.
Is that right? 1,500 million? That may be about right, yeah.
It's huge.
So, yeah, that's all right. Yeah, it's a lot, right? I mean, I think it works out to 20 times our population is an amount of human equivalent work that is required. Okay, so that's just to keep us going. So you were mentioning steady state. That would be just to keep us going. But now we got to start thinking about surplus, right? Because we didn't get to our enormous size without actually there having been prior growth. So even if we were at a steady state now, that was only by virtue of there being all sorts of innovations in the past that enabled us to get to our current size. Just like we start as babies and we grow through infancy to being teenagers and then eventually to adulthoods. And it was by being healthy and robust and effectively innovative that we enabled ourselves to do this transformation of the matter, using the energy in food to transform the matter of food into flesh and bone. And we are doing the same thing over time. We have used energy to efficiently turn a surplus of energy, always a surplus, because all it has to be a surplus, because otherwise we just, standing still, treading water. And it's by having the surplus. In the past, we've been able to do always this phase transformation of the Earth's crust into the stuff of civilization that has enabled us to grow so that our energy needs are now at whatever it is 1,500 billion people equivalent per day. But, of course, we don't just want to tread water. We want a surplus. Because if we don't have a surplus, if we're not growing, then it's very hard. People talk about treading water, staying still, but if you're constantly changing your environment, depleting the energy resources around you, unless you're growing to discover new energy resources, it's going to be hard to maintain that. We are always depleting our reserves, so we have to constantly grow into new reserves of oil and gas and coal and whatever in order to even just keep sustaining ourselves. And so that surplus, it turns out, this is the part that is more unique to what I have done and is not in other people's work, is that the GDP is not our energy consumption. So the economic measure of our productivity does not tie to our rate of energy consumption. Our rate of energy consumption has nothing to do, for the most part, with production. It's more with sustenance of where we are now. Just keeping us going. Just that, for us personally, that 2,500 calories a day. But production the GDP is gross domestic product.
Mm-hmm. Our production
it's about our production. It's not gross domestic sustenance, it's gross domestic production. It's about the growth of civilization. And that's the thing that I showed empirically and showed theoretically and backed it up.
Can you repeat it?
Sorry.
Can you repeat it? So GDP is not directly tied to our energy consumption, but rather...
Well, okay. It is tied to our energy consumption, but somewhat indirectly. So let's go back to what Locke has said in 1922. He said the wheel can grow only if there is an excess. Mm-hmm. So if we are able to consume more than we need for sustenance, then there is a residue, to use Locke's words, that is left over that we can use. It's only a very small residue, but there's a residue that's left over to go to the Earth's crust and say, we're going to make some transformations now and turn you into more of us so that we can grow. So that's enlarging Locke's wheel. It's enlarging civilization only if there is a surplus. So mathematically, it's not the amount of energy we consume that matters directly. Almost all that goes just to keeping us alive. It's about the surplus of energy. So it's the difference between what we consume and what we need that leaves a residue, a small residue, that is available to enable us to put on weight. And that's the thing that is tied directly to the gross domestic product. Not the energy we consume, but rather the difference between what we consume and what we need.
So you're talking surplus is tied to GDP.
The surplus, and of course, economists, they do talk about this. Surplus being a key ingredient to the GDP. What I've done is show how this is actually a thermodynamic reality that is not tied to energy, but rather to having more than you need. And also it's about a material transformation, using that energy for a material transformation to enable us to grow. So there's a couple of, rather subtle ingredients in here. It took me a while to put it together. But that's the thing that's different than what others are arguing.
But you just said it's not to do with energy, but it is to do with energy because that's to do with an energy surplus.
It is. So this is where we keep coming back to, you cannot look at energy alone. You have to look at energy and matter. Because it is the energy surplus that enables, because we as a society always need energy just to keep us going. Unless we have a surplus, we can't actually do that phase transformation of turning the Earth's crust into the stuff of us, which actually, and I didn't mention another part, which is also a key ingredient that's actually tied to inflation, which is that we are constantly falling apart. There's constant decay we have to battle. So when we transform the Earth's crust into the stuff of us, we got two things we have to do. One is we want to grow, but another is we have to repair. So somebody who looked at my work came up with a great line, and I rather like it, so I'm going to adopt it. It's energy to maintain and energy to gain. Most of it's for maintenance, but a little bit, very, very little bit, it's just a fraction of percent, is available every day of those 300 million barrels to be used not just to keep us going, but to gain.
Okay, could you lay out the equation just really simply? So energy surplus plus materials plus waste?
Okay.
Yeah, can you do that? Can you do it like that for me?
Okay, so the simplest equation is that the rate of change in our energy demands is tied through a constant. It doesn't change from year to year to year to year, to the inflation adjusted GDP. So if our energy consumption needs are growing, then that's tied to the GDP. Or a better way to think about it is that in order to merely have the GDP, I'm not talking about the GDP growth rate. So economists often say, when we're talking about the GDP, they often assume you're talking about GDP growth. I'm just talking about the existence of like an economy, period. Adjusting for inflation. In order to have an economy, we actually have to grow our energy consumption rates, which is kind of frightening. Because energy growth and energy consumption is what's causing all our environmental problems. So just even having energy consumption is causing a ton of environmental problems. But the growth is accelerating it. But if we don't have the growth in our energy consumption, then we won't have a GDP and everything collapses economically. And that's where I get a lot of pushback, but that's what is supported by the physics and observations. And the thing then is that how do you get this increase in energy consumption? Well, you cannot have an increase in energy consumption without an increase in networks. You cannot have an increase in networks without this material transformation. That material transformation can only happen if we have more energy available to us than we actually need just to tread water. There has to be this surplus. So,
Okay.
sorry, I mean, there's a lot of little ideas that are being tied in together, but these are, can I just bring it back to a growing child, that this is actually really familiar. Like, you have a kid's doing exactly this. They're consuming food, they're taking the energy in the food to just keep them going. But if there's a surplus, then they have enough energy to turn that food matter into growth of flesh. And there's numbers here. That kid might require 1,000 calories per day. And there's actually a number we know for a pound of flesh of a human requires 3,500 calories. So this is a number that, a lot of people know. I don't know if you think in kilojoules, but, just multiply by 4 to get kilojoules. But anyways, let's say 3,500 calories per pound of flesh.
Like to create a pound of flesh.
Yeah, you have to have, if you eat 500 calories extra per day than you actually need for sustenance, then you gain a pound in a week.
Right, yeah.
But it's about the surplus, right? And then if you've gained a pound in a week, then presumably at the end of that week, generally your appetite's gone up.
Right. Okay. Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Definitely. Okay. So, I mean, we can keep using this imagery, right? It sounds like to me we need to put civilization on a diet.
Yes.
And that's what degrowth is. Degrowth is about reducing energy demands and material demands. And ultimately, like, reducing the size of our civilizations then, in order to create a society that is much more evenly distributed with regard to resources and wealth, that also doesn't destroy the only habitat that our species and other species we share this planet with are built to survive in.
Okay, well, as anyone who's tried to diet knows, that's hard to do.
Yes. But it is possible.
I think the reason, yes, you can do it, but why is it hard? And one reason it's hard is because you've already created the networks in your body. We've already created the networks in civilization that are there to exploit resources. How do we stop exploiting resources that are out there? If those resources are there to exploit and we have the networks that go to them, we're talking about, effectively destroying those links to the resources that we could profitably use to sustain ourselves, and maybe would argue increasingly strongly that we need to sustain ourselves when we're faced with things like climate change. I mean, if the sea level's rising, why are we going to destroy a bunch of oil rigs when that oil rig would help us, create the diesel that's required to build the seawall?
Yeah. But I think this is, if I may I?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
See, maybe this is where we need to continue teasing out these links between energy, matter, and economy, because I've got this thing written down here from your work that it requires that 7.1 watts are required to maintain every $1,000 of historically accumulated economic production. And that's thingied for inflation. Now, it seems to me, following that maths and also following everything that we know about the unequal distribution of wealth and energy and the amount of energy and materials that the 1% globally are using up, it sounds to me that we could redirect some of these existing energy, materials, and wealth in order to combat those problems without having to keep growing. Like, there's a huge surplus available. It's just being used by a tiny fraction of the population for absolute nonsense.
Yeah. And yeah, that was part of the work that I was working on, was that as I actually started getting mathematically difficult. But
Okay.
but I'll try to explain that you think about things having inertia. Why do we keep going the way we have always gone? And that's because of things, I really like to think it's our culture. We have with us not just all the infrastructure we've created from the past, but the knowledge we have of how to use it. And that includes things just even like human language or the alphabet. When that number you mentioned, which I related energy consumption to value, there is value that is considered to be available to be sold on the markets. And that's what economists would call capital. But I think there's a much larger sense of value. There is a value in our human connections. There's the value in our language. There's a value in our alphabet. There's a value in, Bach's St. Matthew's Passion. These aren't things that can be sold on markets, but they are part of a collective human culture that makes us who we are, and it makes us want to keep going, makes us want to keep spinning Locke's wheel. If we were to take away the alphabet, clearly things would collapse, or would be far more impoverished, even though this isn't something that can be marketed. This is embedded in who we are. And so I think about this wheel, Locke's wheel, just wanting to keep on spinning because it's been built up from the past, and we carry the past with us. And there's a famous Faulkner line: the past is never dead, it's not even past. And we have this with us, so there's inertia into what we have now, and we are fighting against inertia. I think at the moment is that we want to keep going the way we've always been going. And then the work I took beyond that was to think, well, is there inertia to growth too? And I think there is inertia to growth, because part of our way of being, or any creature's way of being, is that if it is presented with a surplus of energy, part of its very DNA is to grow into that surplus of energy. Because if that weren't in its DNA, then it never would have emerged as a species in the first place. And so we have the mechanisms now through things like exploitation of resources that enable us to grow into those resources. Now, could we lop off the top 1%? Which is, I think, what you're asking. And
redistribute, not lop off.
Redistribute the wealth. Okay. And that's a really interesting question. So it turns out everywhere you look in the universe, you see a distribution of wealth. It doesn't matter what the phenomenon is. There's the same distribution, effectively, of wealth. You have to define wealth the right way, but there's basically a distribution where a few have a lot and a lot have a little. And the relationship between the few having a lot and a lot having a little is actually the same wherever you look, whatever phenomenon you look at. You have something called power laws. So I see this in cloud droplets. I see this in clouds. People see this in the frequency of words in books and whatever language you look at. There's the size of meteoroid strikes on the moon, solar flares. I mean, almost you name it, there is this relationship between the rich and the poor that's always there. Even the frequency of wars. Like there's a wonderful paper by an atmospheric scientist, Richardson, about the frequency of what he called deadly quarrels. And he identified that there's a lot of small quarrels. He looked even at Manchurian bandits and Chicago gangs when he was looking at this. And then, of course, you have world wars. And of course, the world wars are far less frequent than the little skirmishes. But they all lie along a line that's the same line that I would see in a book, in the frequency of words. The same slope, exponent in this parallel. And so if you have a wealthier society, a one that can consume more energy, then what that enables is actually a few really rich people. So if you have very little energy to go around, you're not going to have a mega billionaire because there wasn't even a mega billions to go around in the first place. But if in a tremendously wealthy society that's been built up from the past, from all our past innovations, we can now create, I was just reading, we might even create our first, trillionaire.
Yeah.
Right? But that's a byproduct of two things. One is that we are an immensely consumptive civilization now. We have that 300 million barrels of oil per day. And then we have these power laws, this distribution that's found everywhere in nature. And so the poor are always with us, but we might be able to extend out to creating these ultra rich too. And you could say, well, we could redistribute, but then I guess I'm left as a physicist thinking, well, I have socialist inclinations myself, but then I'm skeptical that it would actually work in the end because, physics. And there's reasons for this, I think, that are solid foundations.
I suppose one counter argument would be the fact that there is a diversity of cultures still alive and kicking in the world, although being eradicated even as we speak. And it's incredible the numerous different ways that human beings have organized themselves since the dawn of time, essentially. And there are civilizations that exist today that are much, much, much more egalitarian than our own, less hierarchical, and more considerate of and aware of the necessity of maintaining their habitat in order to survive. Now, of course, these civilizations, these communities either do not have access to or have rejected access to the machinery, knowledge, fuels that our civilization uses to maintain its immense size and continue growing. But they do exist. Now, how do we square that? Is it that they then are part of a larger network in which we are the bit in the power law that has all the resources and they are part of the many that has very few? When we start thinking about systems within systems, you know what I mean? Like, how do we, could we just expand the frame so that, I don't know, maybe further out somewhere else in the universe is that bit of the power law that has a lot, and we are the collective on this planet that, has a little, but is better off because of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're probably right, which is that, if you want egalitarian societies, or I would suspect that the power law is probably everywhere, that there's always going to be some, I think actually it has to be the case that there's some with more and many with less. It's just the stretching of that difference is going to be much smaller if there's less energy to go around in the first place. And we are so rich that we are able to, create this large difference. And I think this is because this comes out of the fact that we are what I would call a thermodynamically open system, because that wheel is spinning and we're all competing for a little portion of the spinning in this wheel. Some will have more, some will have less, but we'll always have this power law. But it raises an interesting question, I think, what you're talking about. And, we can start thinking about trying to make predictions. I mean, as a scientist, scientists make predictions. Most of the time, of course, they're totally wrong, but, try to make predictions. I think we're looking, as you just started, that we're looking at a crisis. If we are looking at a crisis, a world in which we collectively become somewhat more impoverished, one where either we can't access the energy that makes us rich because climate change is making it harder, or because we can't access the energy that makes us rich because it's just not there as much as it used to be because we've depleted the reserves. In that world where things are in a phase of decline or perhaps even collapse, does the world become socially more egalitarian? If it was the wealth that made us less egalitarian in the first place, on the flip side, do we become more egalitarian as we become poorer? And I'm not sure, because I think the phase of growth is different than the phase of decline. But I'm sure there are plenty of people who could, address this question more competently than I am. But I think it's a valid question to look at. I think also you could ask the question of things like renewables. Well, we could say renewables are wonderful for saving us from climate change, which, as I mentioned, I don't think is actually true. But they are also new sources of energy. And if energy is plausibly tied to inequality, because you can't have inequality without there being a large amount of energy to go around, then are new sources of energy like renewables really just pushing us further apart?
I mean, at the moment they are, right? I think renewables are, sort of 2% of global energy production added on top of an increasing production and consumption of fossil fuels. The more we have access to, the more that we use. But that's what you've just said is such an interesting sort of reframing of the problem. We cannot have inequality without that kind of surplus of energy to go around. And so would decreasing the energy supply sort of solve that problem, or at least begin to tackle it, and then also solve the problem of using up, too much of a material footprint?
Yeah, I mean, they're fun problems to think about. And the thing is that I think there are many analogs. Like I can think of many analogs in the atmosphere. Low energy cloud for me is a fog. In a fog, almost all the droplets are about the same size. High energy cloud is a cumulonimbus. In a cumulonimbus cloud, almost everything's possible. I mean, you get everything from tiny droplets to massive hailstones. And the inequality is highest in the highest energy clouds.
That is so interesting.
But eventually a cumulonimbus cloud dies.
Right.
And hailstones fall out, and all that's left is tiny, tenuous little ice crystals.
What happens to a fog?
Oh, it does too. Yeah, of course. It just, you're from England. Or Scotland. I don't know what happens to a fog. It'll just last for another few
actually,
days.
They're constant.
I grew up in Nova Scotia, so I know that very well.
See, this is why I love speaking with you, with physicists, because there's so many clues in physics as to the possibilities and limitations of what's going on, what's happening, what will happen. There are literally laws of the universe that we cannot escape. And so much of the modern world, so much of modernity is dressed up in language that makes it almost impossible to understand what is going on, to really see clearly what is going on. Whereas that little thing you've just said about, the rate of inequality is highest in highest energy clouds. Ugh, I love that. I just think that reveals so much. So I guess then, though, what we're coming to is like, okay, so say everything is always moving towards its surplus, its energy supply, especially if there's a surplus. It's trying to grow into, as you said, its energy surplus. We, as a species, as part of an ecosystem, as part of a planetary system, are also, subject to those sort of thermodynamic forces. However, we also have this capacity to discuss, reflect, choose, not choose things that are out with the laws of thermodynamics, but it seems like it could be, from everything that you're saying, it seems that it is thermodynamically possible to reduce the complexity of our systems in order to reduce our energy demands and reduce our material demands and, reduce inequality while we're at it. But politically, it seems almost impossible to imagine because of this accumulation of civilization that we've acquired, that is this spinning wheel, but also because of, some sort of sprinkling of thermodynamics here of, you just kind of, energy seems to take the easiest path available, like water. And right now the easiest path available is just continuing.
And for growth. And I think you raise a really good point here. And it's one, I have to confess I've been slightly dismayed, I think, by the fact, we are facing such serious problems. This isn't a joke. We are facing a crisis, as you put it. And also, as you put it, here we have this tool that we've accepted, hook, line, and sinker, for pretty much everything in our society, which is the tools of modern physics. There's nothing around us that isn't somehow based on, in the modern world, it's based on what we've learned from physics. Yet, for some crazy reason, which I don't understand, there seems to be this barrier that is set up between applying the tools of physics to thinking about the evolution and trajectory of society. And I'll confess, I don't know what the solutions are. I suspect there aren't really solutions because we are on this deterministic pathway. But why aren't there tons of people who are thinking about these things, trying to think if there really is some sort of way out there that is actually consistent with thermodynamics, that's consistent with these ideas of Locke's wheel? Why is Locke's wheel just some fringe paper I have to uncover from the 1920s and not the basis of all our thinking, since we've realized that we're facing issues with resource depletion and climate change? And I know the reason why. It's because of economists, and it's because they are not open to thinking about new ways of approaching these problems at the same times as they are the ones who are most influential at dealing with policy. And I saw this with my own eyes. I was at a National Academies meeting in DC in early November last year. And there was climate scientists and economists. And I thought, well, this is a chance for, a vibrant discussion. And no, that was just not possible. They lived in their own world. And it was a world where the most important thing to them was getting published in the top 5 journals in economics. It wasn't solving problems by whatever means necessary. It wasn't about incorporating physics. I feel it's a missed opportunity and a profound one at that. Yeah.
It seems to me that, and tell me if I'm way off base, but if we were to incorporate physics into the degrowth model, right? It seems to me that what we need is to think about a cycle, and not just a cycle with regards to circular economy, but like to figure out a range in which it's safe to grow and then pathways of decay in order to then grow again. Because a steady state is not constant, right? Like we need access to this surplus. There is this impetus towards growth. But if we can kind of use this amazing intellect that we have, this capacity to communicate, if we could put all, 8 billion brains on the problem, it seems like if it's thermodynamically possible, then it is possible to figure out pathways of decay that then once they hit the lower end of that limit can then turn around and grow again. It seems to me that would be the kind of, that's how a system works, right? It's constantly in flux, but there's a safe range. I mean, that's why, we've crossed 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries, right? We've overshot the 6 range of the health. Yeah.
So I think that's exactly how I framed the problem in my own mind when I was trying to look at this. So I think about a wave.
Yeah.
There's 2 waves. We're still on the rising part of a wave moving up, right? And that wave, let's say if a cork on the wave, there's a couple things that could happen. One is that wave could decline, right? Come back down to rise again. And, it's kind of a form of steady state because it's oscillating, it's going up and down, and it's, about some mean height. And then the other type of wave, of course, is the one that crashes on the beach. And you may be on the backside of that wave, completely agnostic to any knowledge of the fact that there is a beach that's ahead of you, and eventually that wave will crash because you're on the backside. You can't see it. You feel like, wow, this is a great ride. I'm riding up that wave. And of course, that wave that crashes, and it's gone. There may be another wave that comes behind it, but it's that cork has lived out its life. And so when I create mental models for how things might happen, those are sort of 2, that's a dichotomy I think of. And I don't know, I think it's a useful one. Are we looking at decline or are we looking at collapse? And collapse for me would be one where things don't recover, and decline, maybe there's a potential to recover. One result that came out from the work I did, and it's just me, and I don't know, it seemed to make sense to me, which is that if for a system that is growing particularly rapidly, I would use the word super exponentially, so that the rate of growth is itself growing with time, which is where we have been. Because we have this growing GDP, we actually have a rate of growth that is itself growing with time. That our energy consumption demands were only like 1% growth per year in 1970, and now it's like 2.4%. We're actually really healthy right now. It's surprising. I thought we would have decayed by now, and no, we're going gangbusters still. So our rate of growth per year is 2.4% per year. That's crazy. I mean, that is a doubling time of 30 years. Can you imagine? Our demands will be twice as big in our lifetimes.
Yeah.
And when you have that situation, when the conditions that support that massive growth go away, then it's that cork is like that wave on that beach in Hawaii. That's a situation that tends to come before what I would say is a super exponential decline or a collapse. So I think we're headed for collapse, not a decline. But I think ultimately, too, wouldn't it be great if there just more people were even thinking about these things? And there just aren't. And so, well, I mean, I have no funding to do this, and it's not really possible to get funding. Why is this such an obscure area? Why are those who work on these sorts of problems like we all know each other? I cloud physics. I don't know everybody does cloud physics. I mean, that's a far less important field than trying to figure out where civilization's going.
To me, it seems like a kind of no-brainer, but maybe it's a no-brainer after having done like the preliminary research, of the past few years, to be like, oh yeah, obviously, the holy trinity: energy, materials.
Yeah, sure.
Economy.
I like that.
And at the core of that is, physics, keeping it all going.
Yeah, of course.
But I think this is really exciting, everything you've just said, because this, I think, is a kind of realistic and potent message that we need to be putting out there, that we are absolutely headed for a super exponential collapse the way things are going. However, there is possibility to manage the decline. And degrowthers talk about this. They talk about degrowth either by disaster or by design, which I think is a pretty good line. And if that's possible, that oscillating wave function, as you're talking about, which also seems like quite a fun sort of mathematical thing to figure out.
Course,
not for me, because I'm not a mathematician or physicist, but like even for society as a whole, to be like, okay, ethically, like what are we going to prioritize? What kind of a species are we going to be? Who do we choose to be? We've got this amount, to go around. How do we figure out how to do this to the best of our abilities? I mean, it's a fun mathematical, physical, ethical, legal, political question.
All these things. I mean, get all these people together thinking about a similar problem. Why not?
Why not? Well, why not? I think you have to kind of confront. You have to confront, first of all, don't you? I had an interesting experience recently where a conference where I was at, where most people in the room are sort of working towards the betterment of the world. That was one conference. And then another conference I was at where those people were not working towards the betterment of the world, but working towards the betterment of their own lives. The people working towards the betterment of their own lives are more willing to confront the things that I was saying about collapse than the people working towards the betterment of the world. And I found that just totally fascinating. And I wondered if it's because, the kinds of things that we're saying here today, it really throws out, any ideas of like incremental change or, just tweaking the current system or even reforming it slightly. We're talking about a huge overhaul of our cultural, societal, political, energy, material DNA. And so I think for the people that we need to be having these kinds of conversations, they're totally capable of doing it. And I believe in their capacity, and I believe in like their willingness. But first of all, they need to get over the hurdle of accepting perhaps that, all of the work up till now has kind of been for naught. And that's tough emotionally.
Well, there's the wheel, right? It's we have that inertia with us, the stuff that's come before. But I would agree that a big part of this is having some intellectual flexibility of just I don't know. I mean, maybe that's one of the, I mean, why has physics been successful? I think it's because there's this culture of the joy of being wrong. It's wonderful. I mean, I learned something. Oh, wow, that's great. I go on to something new. And I think that, I mean, without that, it's hard to make any progress because we need, obviously, like you say, we haven't done things right. I mean, to the extent that we ever wanted to do it right in the first place, we haven't done things right. We are now worse off than we were. Our carbon dioxide emissions rate, I mean, it's accelerated.
Yeah.
Even now, 2024. Yeah. It's not. This isn't like a new problem.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting then to kind of think about that wheel, because things are changing. There was this, after the post-war boom. Actually, do you know what? No, never mind. I'm going to correct myself mid-sentence. I was thinking about the fact that access to materials and energy were translating into like a higher quality of life. And now that there's this like massive discrepancy where inequality within countries is increasing. But actually, that's a very westernized view that I was going to take, because the quality of life for people in the majority world at that time they were still being totally devastated by colonialism and neocolonialism. So I don't think that's something to extrapolate. It's more just that like the chickens of that system are coming home to roost, I think. Have you read End Times by Peter Turchin?
No, I haven't, but I did interview him once for a group. And he was wonderfully friendly. I was very nervous interviewing him. And because, of course, he's so accomplished. And he was just a tremendously friendly, open guy. It was wonderful.
Oh, brilliant. I'd like to see that interview. I'd like to get him on the show.
Well,
actually.
it was just a private thing for a group that was being arranged, and someone in Switzerland. But it was, okay. Yes. But of course, what he has done is he's trying to apply statistical methods to take data from history and try to identify particular patterns there. I hope to see some convergence between that approach and an approach that was perhaps based a little bit more in thermodynamics. And I think I'd expect to see that, just as I would expect to see that for something like weather prediction. We're now using artificial intelligence very successfully which is just statistical methods, just looking at past patterns and using that to predict the future. But then we also have physics equations, and we have numerical models that are used to predict the weather, and they should ideally come up with similar answers.
Well, I really liked Peter's theory of societal collapse and unrest sort of being driven by elite overaccumulation and elite aspiration, and the group of the under elites taking down another elite. And yeah, I just thought when you kind of like swap out the language and you think about energy and resources and these kinds of things and materials, it made for a really, really interesting argument. And I think it fits in nicely to what you've been saying here today as well, about that wheel just endlessly spinning, and no matter what kind of like political formation we put on top of it, like linguistically, it remains the same. And so to change course, we're going to have to, I feel like society often tries to change course by redrawing the map. So we're actually going in the same direction, but we've made it look quite different. Whereas what is demanded of us now is really actively using our energy, our materials, and our political know-how to change the course of the machine, rather than just sort of drawing a different map around our environment and claiming that things are new. Yeah.
That's tough problems.
Well, Tim, I think we managed to cover quite a bit today. I think we've I think we've got a lot of it figured out, quite frankly. Maybe not. Maybe not the actual physics of, the next bit or the actual political bit of the next bit, but the fact that they are possible, that is critical.
I'm grateful to you for setting up things like this, where you are interviewing people from a wide range of backgrounds and perspectives who are talking about similar problems. And I think that was just what we were talking about, which is that there needs to be more of this. And I'd like to be optimistic that it's these types of discussions that will help guide us towards more equitable solutions for the difficult times.
Yeah, I think we've got to be, right? It's got to be. Otherwise, what's the point? No point having all the knowledge and just getting sad about it. Got to have the knowledge and get active. And on that note, if anybody listening, if you want to fund a Planet Critical think tank with Tim and Steve and a whole bunch of the other Planet Critical guests, you reach out to me. Happily help set that up. I get those emails.
Snowflakes are important too.
Yeah, of course. We'd have a snowflake. We'd have a snowflake section.
Subsection.
I get emails about twice a year from people being like, we need to set up a think tank. And I say, yes.
Yeah.
And then there's
There's not the money.
There's not the money for this kind of big picture stuff. But we persevere together. Anyway,
yes,
Tim,
we do.
Thank you so much for today. I really love speaking with you. This is great. My final question,
Thank you very much, Rachel.
is who would you like to platform?
Oh, goodness. Well, you have such a wonderful list so far. And sorry, I'm spacing on his name right now, but there is somebody. If you haven't done him already, interviewed him already, he did the collapse of the Roman Empire, and he's based down the highway from me at Utah State. And so why am I spacing on his name? That's terrible. And I actually met him in DC at that meeting I mentioned. And he is a wonderful wealth of knowledge about the trajectories of civilizations and how, as they get more complex, they get more vulnerable to collapse. Wonderful. Joe Tainter. There we go. Joe Tainter.
Do you know what? I know his name. I've read some of his stuff, and I would love to get him on the show. So thank you very much for platforming him.
Okay.
Well, Tim, this has been great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Rachel.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter inspired by each interview. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.